In September 1940, a man stood on a Warsaw street and waited to be arrested. He was not hiding, not running, with no intention of escaping. This moment, this street, this fate, he had chosen all of it deliberately, with full knowledge of what came next. He knew the Germans were conducting a roundup, knew where the trucks were going. He stepped forward anyway. His name was Witold Pilecki, and he was about to walk into Auschwitz on purpose. Most men who heard the name of that camp went cold with dread. Pilecki heard it and saw a mission. To understand why, you have to understand what Poland looked like in the autumn of 1940. Germany had invaded a year earlier. The Soviet Union had invaded from the east. The country had been carved in two and was being systematically destroyed, its officers shot, its intellectuals executed, its Jews herded into ghettos. Warsaw itself was a city under occupation, where a wrong turn or a suspicious glance could end your life. Children sold newspapers and smuggled medicine. Priests were arrested for saying the wrong things in Latin. The occupiers had made it a crime to be Polish in any way that mattered. Pilecki was 39 years old. He had fought in the Polish-Soviet War as a young man, had been a cavalry officer, a farmer, a husband, a father of 2 children. When Germany invaded in 1939, he fought again, retreating with his unit until the campaign collapsed. But Pilecki was not the kind of man who stopped. By 1940, he was a founding member of the secret Polish army, one of the earliest resistance organizations in occupied Poland. And through that underground network, disturbing reports had begun to filter out of a new German camp being built on the grounds of a former Polish military barracks near the town of Auschwitz. The Germans called it Konzentrationslager, Auschwitz. Nobody on the outside knew exactly what was happening inside. The reports were fragmentary, terrifying, impossible to fully credit. Polish prisoners were dying in large numbers. The conditions were inhuman. But the Polish resistance, and through them, the Polish government in exile in London, needed more than fragments. They needed a witness, organized intelligence, someone inside. Pilecki volunteered. Sit with that for a moment. The reports that had reached him were already bad enough to make experienced resistance fighters go pale. He had a wife, Maria, a son, Andrzej, and a daughter, Zofia. He had a life, a farm, a future, or at least the possibility of one. And he volunteered anyway. Not because he was ordered to, not because he drew the short straw, but because he looked at the problem and decided that someone had to go, and he was willing to be that someone. He did not tell his wife the full truth of what he was planning. He could not. Some silences are an act of mercy. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. He would allow himself to be caught in a German street roundup, a Hayapanka, the Poles called them, sudden sweeps in which German forces would block off a neighborhood and arrest everyone they found. He would go in without his real identity, becoming Tomasz Serafiewicz, a name attached to a set of false documents. Whatever happened next, Witold Pilecki would not officially exist inside those walls. On September 19, 1940, he did exactly that. Surrendering the false documents, he was loaded onto a truck with dozens of other men, most of them terrified, none of them there by choice. 2 days later, after a processing stop that included beatings designed to establish the new order of things, Witold Pilecki passed through the gates of Auschwitz. He was registered as prisoner number 4859. What he found inside was worse than the reports had suggested, and the reports had been bad. Auschwitz in 1940 was not yet the machinery of industrialized mass murder it would become. That horror was still being built, still being imagined by the men who ran the camp. But what existed was already a place designed to break, degrade, and kill. The prisoners, at this stage largely Polish political prisoners, intellectuals, and soldiers, were worked to exhaustion, beaten at random, starved deliberately. The camp's first commandant, Rudolf Huss, had created a system of casual cruelty enforced by guards and by a hierarchy of prisoner functionaries who were themselves brutalized into brutality. Imagine it. You are Witold Pilecki, and you have just arrived by choice in a place most men would give everything to escape. You are hungry and cold. Your head has been shaved and you are wearing a striped uniform with a number sewn onto it. The man to your left was pulled off a tram that morning. He has no idea why he was arrested. The man to your right is dying. Not metaphorically, not slowly, but visibly today. The guards do not see either of them, and you cannot reveal to any of them who you are or why you are here, because that information, in the wrong hands, would kill you both. Pilecki did not break. Within weeks of his arrival, he had begun to organize. He found men he could trust, former soldiers, former officers, men who still had discipline inside them, men who had not yet been reduced to the animal calculation of pure survival. He approached them carefully, obliquely, watching their reactions before he said anything that could not be unsaid. A wrong read meant death. Not just for him, but for everyone he had already recruited. He called it the Zwykaczek Organizacji Wojskowych, the Union of Military Organizations, abbreviated ZODA. He recruited carefully, one prisoner at a time, verifying trustworthiness through existing networks and gut instinct, knowing that a single informer would mean death for everyone. The organization grew in cell structures, each member knowing only the people immediately above and below them. It was the architecture of conspiracy, built inside a place specifically designed to make conspiracy impossible. The Germans understood the threat of organized prisoners. They had capos, prisoner overseers, who were incentivized to report any sign of coordination. They had informers among the prisoners themselves, men who traded information for marginally better rations or reduced punishment. Every conversation was a calculation. Every friendship was a risk. To look too healthy was suspicious. To look too sick was to become a target. Pilecki navigated all of it every day for nearly 3 years. The goals of ZO were threefold. First, to gather intelligence about the camp and transmit it to the outside. Second, to support prisoners, to help the sick, share extra food where it could be obtained, maintain morale, keep human beings human in conditions designed to make humanity impossible. Third, and most ambitiously, to be ready if the moment ever came to arm an uprising and take the camp by force, ideally in coordination with a Polish paratrop from the outside. That third goal never came, but the first two were achieved against extraordinary odds. Pilecki's reports began reaching the outside world in 1941. He used a network of prisoners who worked outside the camp's perimeter, in farms, in workshops, in construction crews, passing handwritten messages through contacts in the surrounding town of Oehechem, relaying them up through the resistance chain to Warsaw, and eventually, through the courier networks of the Polish government in exile, to London. The messages were small. They had to be. A note hidden in the lining of a coat. A message memorized and recited to a contact who memorized it further. The information traveled in fragments, in whispers across hundreds of miles, from one careful hand to the next. Where people, what pilat doidens ever war, mass shootings and deliberate starvation in the Lodom, its thanes peopleans according to historical accounts. Zyklon B, a pesticide that camp administrators had discovered could also kill human beings in enclosed spaces. The expansion of the discretion at Birkenau, the Sechenau, larger campsite just a few kilometers away, and what that expansion was clearly being built for. By late 1940 office somewhere, he told them. The Polish government in exile received the reports. They passed summaries to the British government. Some of the material found its way to the United States. There were officials in London and Washington who saw these documents and read them. Journalists who heard the accounts and argued with their editors. Diplomats who sent cables and waited for responses that were slow in coming and inadequate when they arrived. And here begins one of the most haunting parts of Witold Pilecki's story, because the world, by and large, did not act on what he was saying. This requires some care because the history is genuinely complicated. Some officials doubted the reports. Others believed them but calculated that the war's outcome was the only thing that would stop the killing, and that diverting resources to attack the camp or its rail lines would slow the larger effort. Still others were paralyzed by the sheer scale of what was being described. The systematic, industrial murder of an entire people was so far outside what the human mind had been prepared to accept that it was easier. Somehow, you file the reports of Porta Humaninamat. More evidence was not what was needed. Time was. The Allies did not bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz. They did not drop weapons to the resistance. The paratroop drop that Pilecki had hoped would trigger the uprising never came. The debate over whether bombing would have been practical, whether it would have saved lives or disrupted the wider war effort, is one historians still engage with seriously. There are real arguments on multiple sides. What is not in dispute is that the killing continued at scale while the arguments were being made. Pilecki spent nearly 3 years inside Auschwitz, 3 years watching the camp grow, watching the killing escalate, watching transport after transport arrive from across the continent, watching the smoke rise from the crematoria that he had, in his earlier reports, warned were being built. He continued to organize, continued to transmit, continued to hope that something would change. By early 1943, it was clear to him that no coordinated response was coming, and his own position had become increasingly precarious. The Gestapo was growing suspicious. Arrests within the underground networks were increasing. Several members of ZO had been identified and taken. To stay much longer was almost certainly to die, not as a prisoner, but in the specific, named, deliberate way that the camp reserved for those it wanted to make examples of. On the night of April 26, 1943, Witold Pilecki escaped. He and 2 other prisoners, Jan Redzej and Edward Cielski, had secured work in the camp's bakery, which lay near the perimeter fence. They had spent weeks preparing, watching the guard rotations, identifying the weakest point in the wire. That night they overpowered a guard, cut the telephone lines to delay the alarm, and walked out into the Polish darkness. They were still wearing their camp uniforms. They had no papers. Every farmhouse they passed, every light in a window, was either salvation or death. They spent nights hiding in barns and root cellars, moving only after dark, relying on ordinary Poles who risked their own lives to give them food and shelter. After several weeks of moving through enemy-occupied countryside, they reached the safety of the resistance in the Krakow region. He reported in person, writing a full account of everything he had witnessed, a document that runs to hundreds of pages in its various versions and that historians now regard as one of the most important primary sources on Auschwitz in existence. In it, he described the organization he had built, the methods the Germans used, the scale of the killing, the faces of the commandants, the names of the guards, the routines of the crematoria. He put all of it on paper. He wanted no ambiguity, no room for doubt. And he argued, urgently and repeatedly, for a military response. Bomb the camp. Bomb the rail lines. Drop weapons to the prisoners inside. He had built an organization in there. If they sent weapons and a coordinated signal, there was a chance, a real chance, he believed, to turn the camp against its commanders. It did not happen. He was heard. He was thanked. But he was not acted upon. In August 1944, the Warsaw Uprising began. The Polish Home Army had been planning it for years. A coordinated seizure of the city before Soviet forces arrived, a declaration that Poland would liberate itself and emerge from the war as a sovereign nation rather than a Soviet satellite. Pilecki took part. He was no longer the young cavalry officer who had walked into a roundup 4 years earlier, but he was still Pilecki. And when the fight came, he went toward it. The uprising lasted 63 days. Home Army fighters held sections of the city against massive German firepower, fighting in rubble and sewers, in basements and on rooftops. Warsaw's civilian population fought alongside them, handing ammunition and tending wounds and continuing to exist in the ruins of a city that was being deliberately, systematically demolished around them. The Allies did not resupply the fighters in time or at the scale needed. And the Soviet army, which had reached the eastern bank of the Vistula, directly across the river from the burning city, paused. The reasons for that pause are debated by historians. What the fighters in Warsaw experienced was simply this: they could see the Soviets on the other bank, and the Soviets did not come. The Germans finished what they had started. The uprising was crushed in early October 1944. Pilecki was captured and sent to a German prisoner of war camp. He survived the war. That is the remarkable thing. He had volunteered for Auschwitz, survived Auschwitz, escaped from Auschwitz, reported everything he had seen, fought in Warsaw, been captured again, and survived. He was alive in 1945 when the war in Europe ended. But Poland did not come back to him as the country he had fought for. The Soviet Union had moved in. A communist government, backed by Moscow, hostile to everything the Home Army represented, hostile to everything Pilecki had spent 6 years of his life defending, had taken power. The officers of the Home Army were being hunted. The men and women who had fought the Germans were being reframed by the new authorities as criminals and traitors and bourgeois nationalists, enemies of the progressive order that was now being installed with Soviet backing. Pilecki returned to Poland anyway in 1945. Some accounts suggest he was ordered to by the Polish government in exile. Others suggest it was his own decision. Either way, it was consistent with who he was. He believed there was still work to be done. He began gathering intelligence again, this time on Soviet military activities and the political situation inside Poland, and passing reports to the government in exile, still hoping that the Western Allies might recognize what was happening and intervene before Poland was fully absorbed. They did not. In May 1927, Polish Communist Security Services arrested Witold Pilecki. What followed was a travesty presented as a trial. He was subjected to months of interrogation, according to accounts that emerged after the fall of communism, accounts from fellow prisoners, from family members, from documents declassified decades later. He was tortured. The man who had survived Auschwitz, who had been beaten and starved and had watched thousands die, was now in the hands of a regime that needed him to be a criminal because the truth of what he was made straight. He was charged with espionage, with illegal border crossing, with carrying illegal weapons, with planning the assassination of a communist security official. The charges were largely fabricated, the verdict predetermined. The purpose was not justice. It was to erase him. In a letter reportedly smuggled out before his execution, the authenticity of which has been accepted by Polish historians, though it should be noted it was not recovered until later, Pilecki wrote that, compared to what the communists were doing to him, Auschwitz had been a trifle. On May 25, 1948, Witold Pilecki was shot in the back of the head in a Warsaw prison. He was 47 years old. His family was not told where he was buried. His grave was not marked. For decades under the communist government, it remained unmarked and unacknowledged. His name was prohibited, erased from Polish history, forbidden in schools and textbooks and public memory. His children grew up unable to speak of their father, unable to explain what he had done or why it mattered. The reports, the sacrifice, the witness, all of it officially suppressed, because the truth of who he was made the new regime look small and made the Soviets look far worse. It was not until after 1989, after the fall of communism in Poland, that Pilecki's story began to be told openly. His reports were declassified. His role was documented by historians. In 2006, the Polish state awarded him the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest military honor, posthumously, by a country that had finally found its voice in the courage to use it. His remains have never been conclusively identified. He may still be in an unmarked grave somewhere in Warsaw. Historians still argue about exactly what the Allies knew about Auschwitz and when they knew it. They argue about whether bombing the rail lines would have saved lives, whether the practical and strategic obstacles were too great, whether earlier action could have changed anything. These debates are real and serious and do not have simple answers, and anyone who tells you they do is not engaging honestly with the evidence. What is not debated is this: a man looked at the worst place his world had produced and chose to walk into it, not because he was ordered to, not because he had no choice, because he believed that if someone documented what was happening there, truly documented it, from inside, with names and numbers and dates, the world would respond. He did everything right. He got in, organized, got the information out. Then he escaped and kept telling them. He fought in the uprising. And he came back to a Soviet-occupied country because he thought there was still something he could do. The world was slow. History was slow. It was very slow. And when the killing was over and the war was won, the country that had taken everything he had left called him a spy. There's no tidy resolution to what Witold Pilecki represents. His is not a story of heroism rewarded. It is a story of what happens when an extraordinary human being does everything within human power, and the forces arrayed against him are simply larger than any one person can overcome. He did not save Auschwitz. He could not. But he documented it. He witnessed it. He made sure that whatever happened next, someone would know. But he went. He went knowing the odds, knowing what was waiting on the other side of those gates. And in the end, his reports exist. His testimony exists. The names of the prisoners he organized, the atrocities he documented, the words he pressed onto paper in that prison cell, they exist. The communists could bury his body in an unmarked hole in Warsaw. They could forbid his name and build a new history on top of the old one. They could not make him not have gone. Some things survived the men who tried to erase them. This was Triecos. Some witnesses cannot be silenced, only buried, and the buried eventually find their way back to the light. The ship's hull cracked like a gunshot in the dark. 28 men stood on the ice and watched their only way home being swallowed by the sea. No radio. No rescue coming. The nearest inhabited land was over 1,000 kilometers across the most violent ocean on Earth. The temperature was 30 degrees below zero. And Ernest Shackleton, the man who had led them here, turned to his crew and said, "We are going home." Every single one of them made it. This is not a metaphor. It is not a parable. All of it happened. It is 1914. The world is about to tear itself apart in the trenches of Europe. But a small advertisement appears in London newspapers. The exact wording is debated, and the advertisement itself may be apocryphal, but the story of who answered the call is not. Men sign up to cross Antarctica on foot, a journey no human has ever completed, through a continent that seems designed specifically to kill. Ernest Shackleton, already famous for 2 previous expeditions to the bottom of the world, will lead them. The ship is called the Endurance. The name, Shackleton's family motto, will become the most fitting word in the history of exploration. They sail from London in August 1914. As they depart, the guns of the First World War begin to fire. Shackleton offers the ship and crew to the war effort. The Admiralty, perhaps wisely, tells him to proceed. Picture the Weddell Sea in January 1915. A body of water on the bottom edge of the planet, below the tip of South America, bordered by Antarctica. It is one of the most treacherous stretches of ocean in the world. Its currents are circular, gathering ice from all directions into a slow, grinding spiral. The Endurance pushes south through pack ice, trying to reach the continent's edge where Shackleton plans to begin the overland crossing. Then, on January 19th, the ice closes around her. Not dramatically. Not all at once. The pack ice simply thickens, hardens, presses from every side, and the ship stops moving. The crew waits. This has happened to polar ships before, and ships have broken free. They wait through February. Through March. The Antarctic autumn arrives, and with it the knowledge that no ship will be going anywhere until spring at the earliest. They settle in. There is no other option. Shackleton makes the ship into a home. He reorganizes the sleeping quarters. He assigns duties that keep men busy and purposeful. The dogs are taken off the ship and given a compound on the ice they called dogloos, small sheltered pens where the animals run and play and provide a strange domesticity in that frozen nowhere. Regular meals are served. Weekly concerts are held in the largest crew space. They put on plays. The carpenter built furniture from salvaged timber. Shackleton himself participates, jokes, argues, listens. He is everywhere at once, never distant, never grandiose. He understands something that most commanders of his era do not. Cold does not break men. Darkness does not break men. Suffering can be endured if it has a frame. What breaks men is feeling forgotten, feeling that they do not matter. Shackleton gives every man on that ship the sense that his survival is personally important to the man in charge. Spring comes. The ice does not release them. Instead, it begins to move. The flows shift, heave, press against one another with the force of millions of tons of frozen water. And the Endurance, caught between them, begins to groan. The sound, crew members would later describe, was unlike anything they had ever heard. the shrieking of timber and iron being slowly, inexorably destroyed. Pressure ridges, where flows collide and fracture upward, rise and fall around the ship like a slow-motion geological event. The ice that had been there out. The ship rides up on the pressure, tilts, lists to one side. The hull timbers, thick, specially reinforced for polar work, begin to give way anyway, because nothing built by human hands was designed for this. Water begins to enter. The pumps run continuously. The men pump by hand in shifts through the night for days. On October 27, 1915, Shackleton gives the order to abandon ship. They move everything they can save onto the ice. Food, fuel, the 3 lifeboats, scientific equipment when there is space. Frank Hurley, the expedition's photographer, negotiates with Shackleton personally over which glass plate negatives to keep. They go through them together and smash the rejected ones on the ice so Hurley will not be tempted to go back for them. The images that survive will become some of the most haunting photographs in the history of exploration. They camp on the ice beside the wreck. They watch it die. For 3 weeks, the Endurance remains partially visible, listing at a terrible angle, her decks tilted toward the sky. Then on November 21, 1915, what remains of her slips beneath the surface. She is gone, and they are alone. Imagine the situation with precision, because the mind tends to smooth over facts this extreme. 28 men. The Antarctic ice shelf. No functioning radio. The ship's wireless had been dead for months. No other humans within range of any conceivable rescue. Summer was coming in the southern hemisphere, which meant the ice would eventually melt, which meant the floes they were camped on would eventually disappear beneath them. They had 3 small wooden lifeboats salvaged from the ship, food for a limited time, and each other. Shackleton first plans to march across the ice to land, dragging the boats. They try it. The surface is nightmarish, fractured, tilted, covered in snow that hides the gaps between floes, treacherous at every step. The boats weigh over a ton each. Some days they make a mile. Some days they make less. The effort is immense and the gain is almost nothing. After about a week, Shackleton stops the march. He makes a decision that takes more courage than the march itself. They will stop where they are and wait. They will let the ice carry them north. The floe is drifting, slowly, irregularly, but drifting in the right direction. Marching is destroying the men for negligible gain. Waiting, if the ice holds, might bring them to open water. They wait for months. Camp patience, they call it. The floe cracks and shifts. One night, a fissure opens directly beneath the tent of a crew member named Holness. He falls into the water, sleeping bag and all. Shackleton, who seems never to sleep, is there instantly. He pulls Holness out with his bare hands. The man survives the night. The sleeping bag does not. Through the summer and into the autumn of 1916 they drift. The ice is deteriorating around them. The floe they stand on grows smaller every week. Finally, in April 1916, 15 months after the Endurance became trapped, the ice breaks up enough that Shackleton gives the order to launch the boats. April 9, 1916, into the open sea. What follows is 7 days on the open water in 3 small wooden lifeboats, in the waters around Antarctica, in autumn, in conditions that professional sailors of the era would have considered a death sentence. The waves in the Southern Ocean, the band of water that circles the planet at these latitudes with nothing to break the wind, can reach 20 meters. The temperature is well below freezing, and the men are soaked continuously. Ice forms on the boats, on the rigging, on their clothing, and has to be chipped off or the weight will capsize them. They cannot sleep properly. They vomit from the motion. The spray freezes on their faces. There is no destination other than survival. They reach Elephant Island on April 15, 1916. It is the first time any of them has stood on solid ground in almost 500 days. 1 year, their assailant, according to accounts, bent down and scooped up a handful of rocks and held them to his face. The gesture requires no explanation. After 500 days on ice that moves, on water that wants to kill you, on a ship that is gone, the stillness of solid earth is almost incomprehensible. But Elephant Island is not a rescue. It is a desolate, uninhabited rock at the northern tip of the Antarctic peninsula. No ship comes here. No one knows they are here, and no one is looking for them. If Shackleton waits, they die. He makes the decision almost immediately. He will take the largest of the 3 lifeboats, the James Caird, 22 feet long and 5 men, and sail to South Georgia, a small island with a whaling station approximately 1,300 kilometers away across the Drake Passage and the Southern Ocean. It is one of the most dangerous stretches of water on Earth. The route takes them directly through the path of the westerly storms that rage continuously around Antarctica. Many sailors consider the Drake Passage impassable in a vessel of any size during the Southern Hemisphere winter. Shackleton proposes to cross it in a lifeboat. He chooses his crew carefully. Frank Worsley, the ship's navigator, is essential. His dead reckoning skills will prove to be one of the most important human abilities ever demonstrated under pressure. He takes 4 others. He leaves 22 men on Elephant Island under the command of Frank Wild. And before he leaves, he tells Wild, and this detail appears in multiple accounts, that relief will come. He says it with the certainty of a man who does not allow other possibilities to exist. Wild believes him. Every morning on Elephant Island, Wild wakes the men with the same announcement. He is rolling up his sleeping bag because the boss is coming today. He says this for months. The James Caird departs Elephant Island on April 24, 1916. What follows is 16 days that belong in a different category of human experience entirely. The boat was modified for the crossing, a canvas deck was added, ballast was shifted, but she is still 22 feet long and the Southern Ocean is still the Southern Ocean. The boat ticks on water continuously, and the men take turns bailing. Sleeping bags freeze solid and never thaw. Their drinking water becomes contaminated with salt water from the spray, threatening dehydration on top of everything else. The seas are, according to Shackleton's own account, the largest he had ever seen in his life, and he had spent 2 decades on the ocean. At one point, he describes looking astern and seeing what he thought was a clearing in the sky, a pale brightness. He realized an instant later that it was not sky at all. It was the white crest of a wave larger than any he had encountered, breaking toward them across the entire visible horizon. They survived it. They barely survived it. Frank Worsley takes navigational sightings when the clouds allow. He gets 4 to 4 moments in 16 days when the sun appears long enough to get a fix. 4 data points to cross 1,300 kilometers of the most chaotic water on Earth. The rest of the time he is dead reckoning, calculating position by compass heading, estimated speed, elapsed time, and intuition forged from a life at sea. Currents in the Southern Ocean can push a vessel dozens of miles off course without any indication. Storms wipe out any pedits tights. On May 8, 1916, 16 days after departing Elephant Island, the James Caird raises the coast of South Georgia. He was 12 kilometers off. 12 kilometers from a target that is 170 kilometers wide after a 1,300-kilometer crossing of the Drake Passage in winter, in a lifeboat, with 4 sun sightings. It may be the greatest feat of dead reckoning navigation in history, and it is almost certainly the greatest performed under those conditions. But they land on the wrong side of the island. The whaling station is at Stromness on the north coast. They are on the south coast. Between them are the mountains and glaciers of South Georgia's interior. Remote, uncharted, never crossed by any human being, never surveyed with sufficient to produce a usable map. The men left with the boat are too exhausted and frostbitten to travel. Shackleton takes Worsley and a crew member named Tom Crean, a veteran of previous Antarctic expeditions, a man of extraordinary physical and psychological toughness, and they set out on foot. 36 hours. No sleep. Improvised crampons screwed through the soles of their boots. A length of rope. A carpenter's adze, used as an ice axe. They navigate by instinct and by the rough shape of mountains they have glimpsed from the sea. They cross crevasse glaciers in the dark. At one point they reach a ridge too steep to descend safely on foot in the time remaining before nightfall. Shackleton makes a decision. They coil the rope into a makeshift sled, sit on it in a chain, and slide. They do not know what is at the bottom, and they slide anyway. They survive. Near Stromness on the night of May 19, they hear a whistle, the whaling station's morning horn announcing the workday. They follow the sound. On May 20, 1916, they walk into Stromness whaling station. The Norwegian whalers who greet them, men who know the Southern Ocean as well as any humans alive, struggle to comprehend what they are hearing. 3 men who have been at sea for almost 2 years have just crossed the interior of South Georgia Island on foot after sailing from Elephant Island in a lifeboat, after drifting on the Antarctic ice for 500 days. The station manager is said to have wept. The sailors stare. Shackleton is not done. He tries immediately to return for the men on Elephant Island. 3 times, pack ice blocks his approach. He turns back, finds another ship, and tries again. Blocked. He secures a 3rd vessel from the Chilean government and tries a 3rd time. Blocked again. He is relentless in a way that appears almost pathological. But it is not pathological. But it is not pathological. But is not pathological. It is the simple refusal of a man who left 22 people alive on a made them a prop. On the 4th attempt, on August 30th, 1916, 4 months and 16 days after he left them, he reaches Elephant Island. He counts the figures emerging from the makeshift shelter on the shore. All 22. Not a single man of the 28 who set out has been lost. Shackleton is reported to have broken down at that moment. He had held himself together for the entire ordeal, for the ice, for the boats, for the crossing, for every impossible night, for every choice that could have killed them all if he had made it slightly differently. He had not allowed himself to feel anything other than purpose and forward motion for almost 2 years. And now, seeing his men alive, he wept. The Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition failed to cross Antarctica. It accomplished nothing it set out to accomplish. Not a single kilometer of the planned overland route was covered. The scientific objectives went unmet. The goal, stated plainly, was not achieved. And it is remembered as one of the greatest achievements in the history of human leadership. In 2022, 107 years after the Endurance sank, an expedition using underwater search technology located her wreck on the floor of the Weddell Sea, more than 3,000 meters below the surface. She was remarkably preserved. The cold, dark, low-oxygen water of the deep Weddell Sea had protected her from the decay that destroys most wrecks. The ship's name is still clearly visible on her stern in raised lettering. The decks are largely intact. She looks, the expedition reported, as though she could almost sail. She cannot sail, but she endured. Ernest Shackleton understood something about human beings that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. He understood that fear and cold and suffering do not break men, but meaninglessness does. A man can endure almost anything if he believes it matters, if he believes someone sees him, if he believes the person leading him has not given up. Shackleton gave his men a purpose on every single day of those 522 days. He gave them tasks, structure, humor, warmth, and the absolute certainty, never once retracted, never once qualified, that they were going home. He was not always a perfect man. History is complicated, and so are its heroes. He had failed before. He would fail again, in other contexts, in other ways. But in those 2 years on the ice, in the boats, in the mountains, he was exactly what 27 men needed him to be. They all came home. This was Triechos. Some men are broken by the impossible. Others simply refuse to let it count. 50,000 soldiers marched into the Egyptian desert. Not one of them ever came back. According to the ancient story, the desert itself rose against them, a towering wall of sand that swallowed men, horses, banners, and ambition whole. Picture one of those men. Dust caked across his face, his eyes narrowed against a sun so bright it turned the horizon to fire, watching that darkness climb the sky. They had carried the orders of a king and the confidence of the greatest empire on earth, marching toward a sacred place hidden beyond the edge of the known world. They crossed a land where footprints vanished almost as soon as they were made. And then, somewhere between the Nile and the Oracle of Amun, they were gone. No bodies. No battlefield. No survivors. No messenger came back to explain the disaster. An entire army, spears, shields, horses, banners, gold, 50,000 men, simply erased from the face of the earth. But did it really happen that way? Did 50,000 men truly die in a single storm? Were they ambushed, betrayed? Or was the sandstorm only a lie, a story invented to bury something far darker? This is the mystery of the lost army of Cambyses. Long before that army marched, Egypt was already ancient. Its pyramids had stood for nearly 2,000 years. Its temples were covered in sacred writing, and its priests guarded rituals older than most kingdoms. Its people lived beside the Nile, the river that turned desert into life. Every year, the Nile rose. Every year, the fields drank. Every year, the priests spoke to the gods, the farmers planted, the scribes counted grain, and the pharaoh kept the world in balance. To outsiders, Egypt looked like a prize. To Egyptians, it was something more, an order woven into the universe itself. And in the 6th century before Christ, that ancient world was about to be shaken by an empire from the east. Persia had become the most powerful force on earth. Its roads crossed mountains and deserts. Its armies were drawn from a dozen peoples. From Anatolia to Mesopotamia, from Iran to the edge of Central Asia, it had grown into something the world had never seen. At its center stood Cambyses II. He was the son of Cyrus the Great, the legendary founder of the empire. Cyrus had not simply conquered, he had built, folding whole kingdoms into a system designed to outlast him. He left his dynasty a reputation for power, order, and destiny. Cambyses inherited that empire, and with it, he inherited a burden. He could not afford to be an ordinary king. He had to prove he deserved his father's throne. So he looked west, toward Egypt. Egypt was wealthy, and it was prestigious. Temples, grain, gold, soldiers, harbors, and a name that carried weight across the ancient world. To take it was not merely to win land, it was to claim one of the oldest civilizations on earth. In 525 BC, Cambyses invaded. The pharaoh Psamtik III marched out to stop him, but the Persian army was too strong. After a single decisive defeat, Memphis fell, the pharaoh was taken, and Persian power reached the banks of the Nile. On the surface, Cambyses had won, but conquest is not the same as control. A city can open its gates and still despise the man who walks through them. A temple can carry on its rituals while quietly refusing the ruler who claims them. To truly rule Egypt, a king had to be more than a conqueror. He had to become pharaoh, accepted into a sacred order. And in Egypt, legitimacy did not come from the sword alone. It came from the gods. Cambyses could command his soldiers. He could not so easily command the gods. And far out in the western desert, beyond the Nile, beyond the familiar cities, beyond the last edge of cultivated land, stood a place that captured that problem perfectly. The oasis of Siwa. Siwa was remote, ringed by open desert, and home to the oracle of Amun. To the Egyptians, Amun was a hidden and immense god, bound up with kingship and divine authority, and his oracle was believed to speak with a voice that could shape destiny itself. Kings feared oracles, because an oracle could do what no army could. It could declare a ruler rejected by the gods. It could turn doubt into rebellion. It could convince an entire people that a foreign king had no right to the throne. A sword could kill a man. A prophecy could kill an empire from the inside. And so, according to the ancient historian Herodotus, Cambyses decided to strike first. He sent an army across the desert to silence the oracle for good. 50,000 men. That number may be exaggerated. Ancient writers loved to inflate their figures until a disaster felt enormous. But even a smaller force, sent into one of the deadliest landscapes on earth, toward a sacred target and never seen again, is terrifying enough. Imagine the army leaving the Nile. Behind them lay Egypt's green world, fields of grain, canals catching the sun, mud brick villages, palm groves, temples, boats drifting down the river. The sound of animals and workers and children, of water, and of life. Ahead of them lay the desert, a world without mercy. At first, the march may have seemed manageable. These were not lost wanderers. They were soldiers of the greatest empire of their age, with commanders, supplies, pack animals, guides, and iron discipline. They had crossed hard country before. But the desert is not an enemy that fights like an army. It does not charge. It does not shout. It does not bleed. It waits. Every step carried them farther from the Nile. Every hour made water more precious than gold. Out here, water was not a supply, it was time itself. Each skin, each clay jar, bought a few more hours of life. A commander could count his men and his weapons, but the only number that truly mattered was simpler than either: how far to the next well, and how much water was left. And the desert worked on the mind as much as the body. The horizon never came closer. The heat bent the air until men saw lakes that were not there. Armor turned to punishment. Sand found its way into eyes and mouths, into the straps of every sandal and the joints of every weapon. Then, at night, the heat fled and the cold came for them. And men who had cursed the sun by day lay shivering beneath the stars. Still, the army marched. Every mile was political. Every dune brought them closer to a collision between empire and oracle. For some, the mission must have felt like more than a campaign. Ancient people did not treat gods as decoration. To march against an oracle was to step into a story already heavy with fear. What if the god saw them coming? What if the desert itself belonged to him? The officers could demand discipline and threaten punishment. But fear does not announce itself. It spreads in whispers. A guide who looks nervous. An animal that refuses to move. A water skin found leaking at dawn. One man says the route is wrong, another swears the wind has changed. And in the desert, uncertainty kills. According to Herodotus, the army reached an oasis, the oasis of the blessed, and there they rested, gathered their strength, and pushed on toward Siwa. After that, the story becomes a nightmare. The men marched deep into the open desert, and then the wind rose. At first, it may have looked like nothing. A faint stirring across the surface of the sand, a dry pressure in the air, a thin brown line low on the horizon. To men who had never lived in the desert, it might have seemed like just another turn in the weather. The guides would have known better. The sandstorm is not merely wind. It is the ground becoming the sky. The air turns yellow, then red, then a choking brown. The sun dies. The horizon disappears. Sand strikes bare skin like 1,000 tiny blades. Breathing becomes painful. Eyes become useless. And commands vanish into the roar. A shouted order travels only a few paces before the wind tears it apart. The front of the column disappears from the middle. The middle disappears from the rear. A formation that looked unstoppable becomes a chain of blind, isolated men, each one trapped inside his own moving wall of sand. Animals panic. Ropes snap. Water jars shatter. Banners whip once and are gone. Men collide with one another, fall, and are trampled. Some try to run, but there is nowhere to run to. The storm steals direction itself. North, south, east, and west collapse into the same blinding brown. The desert does not need to kill every man at once. It only needs to break the army apart. A man cut off from water is already dying. A group cut off from its guides is already lost. And a column cut off from itself is no longer an army at all, only thousands of human beings scattered and alone inside a storm. Imagine a single Persian soldier in that moment. He cannot see the sky, or the road, or the man 10 steps in front of him. His mouth is full of grit. His lungs claw for air. A horse screams somewhere close. A voice cries out for a brother. Another begins to pray. And for the first time, he understands. The empire is not here. Cambyses is not here. The Nile is not here. There is only the desert. And the desert does not care whose king sent him. When the storm at last moved on, the story says, the army was simply gone. No battlefield. No broken city. No smoking ruin. Only dunes. and beneath them, perhaps, men and horses and weapons and bones, buried so deep that the world above forgot the place they lay. This is the version that survived for 25 centuries. The king sent an army. The army insulted a god. The desert swallowed it whole. It is a perfect ancient warning: do not challenge what is sacred. Do not believe that empire can master nature. But history is rarely so neat. Herodotus wrote his account decades after the events. He gathered stories, rumors, and local traditions, and he was a brilliant historian, but he was not a modern investigator. He had no maps, no excavation reports, no Persian military records. He had voices, and voices change as they pass from mouth to mouth. So we are left with a harder question. What if the lost army did not die in a storm at all? What if it was destroyed by men? Egypt was not a silent, obedient province. It was full of local powers, rival claimants, angry priests, and would-be rebels. And the desert was not empty to everyone. Its hidden routes and precious water points were well known to the people who lived and traded there. An invading army that did not know the land would have been desperately vulnerable. A hostile force did not need to beat 50,000 men in open battle. It only needed to lead them astray, cut them off from the wells, strike at the exhausted edges of the column, destroy their supplies, and melt back into terrain the Persians could never understand. In that version, the army was not swallowed by a supernatural storm. It was simply outmaneuvered. And then came the cover-up. Because if a great Persian force had been wiped out by rebels in a newly conquered land, that was a humiliation. An empire can survive losing men. It cannot so easily survive looking weak. But a sandstorm changes everything. If nature destroyed the army, then no human enemy defeated Persia. No rebel leader humbled the king. No Egyptian resistance won glory. The disaster becomes tragic and unavoidable, instead of political. A storm is a convenient enemy. It cannot be questioned. It cannot boast. It cannot lead the next rebellion. It signs no treaty and crowns no rival. It leaves behind only silence. There is even a simpler possibility, that the army was never as vast as the legend claims. 50,000 may not have been a head count at all, but a symbol, ancient shorthand for a force too great and a catastrophe too large to ignore. And yet even 10,000 men, even 5, swallowed by the sand, would still haunt us today. For centuries, that is exactly what they have done. Explorers and archaeologists have searched the sands for them again and again because the idea is irresistible. Somewhere out there, beneath the dunes, bronze arrowheads, Persian daggers, shattered water jars, human bone, a long, scattered line of artifacts marking the final desperate path of men who never came home. And every few decades, the claims return. Someone finds bones. Someone reports weapons. Someone announces that the lost army has finally been found. But the desert both preserves and destroys. It can hide an object for 1,000 years, reveal it for a single afternoon, then bury it again. And it is enormous and endlessly varied. Sand seas, rocky plateaus, salt flats, oases, and dunes that walk across the map. It is a place where an entire army could stay lost for an astonishingly long time. Even if remains were found, proving they belonged to Cambyses would be brutally hard. A sword is not enough. A skeleton is not enough. The desert has been swallowing traders and pilgrims and raiders for thousands of years. To confirm the legend, archaeologists would need a pattern. A dense scatter of Persian military gear remains consistent with one great disaster, a route that matches the ancient account, dates that line up. History asks for more than a dramatic discovery. It asks for proof. And so the lost army hangs suspended between the two. Not quite myth, not quite confirmed. A story with just enough detail to feel real and just enough mystery to stay alive. Maybe that is exactly why it has lasted. Because in the end, it is not only a story about missing soldiers. It is a story about human arrogance. Cambyses believed that power could cross any distance, that an order given on the banks of the Nile could reach across an ocean of sand and crush a god hidden among the dunes. The desert answered him with silence. whether by storm, by ambush, by thirst, or by betrayal. The result was the same. The army did not come back. And whichever version is true, the final hours are terrible to imagine. If it was the storm, men died blind, unable to find water or one another, buried by the sky itself. If it was an ambush, they died realizing far too late that the empty land around them had never been empty at all. If it was thirst, the end came slowly, as discipline dissolved under the oldest need of the body. And if it was a cover-up, then the cruelest blow was not death, but erasure, vanishing once in the desert, and then a second time in the official story. No names, no graves, no return, only a number, 50,000. Most armies leave traces behind. They storm cities, build camps, carve their victories into stone, and live on in records and monuments. This army left only a question, and a question can outlast any monument. More than 2,500 years later, the mystery still pulls us back to the same handful of images. A line of soldiers crossing the desert. A king waiting for news that will never arrive. An oracle standing silent in the distance. A wall of sand rising on the horizon. And then nothing. Cambyses wanted to rule Egypt, to command its cities, its temples, and its gods. He wanted the power of a conqueror and the blessing of a pharaoh. But somewhere in that western desert, his power reached the edge of what power could do. A king could order 50,000 men into the sand. He could not order the sand to give them back. And so the story remains, an empire at the height of its strength, a sacred oracle waiting in the dunes, an army marching out into heat and dust and fear and legend. The wind rises, the sky turns brown, the banners disappear, the voices fade, and 50,000 men become one of the greatest unanswered questions in all of history. On a freezing night in February 1959, 9 experienced hikers cut their way out of their own tent from the inside and walked, half-dressed, into a blizzard that would kill them. They left behind almost everything that could have saved them: their boots, their coats, their food, and the only shelter for miles. Some stepped out into the snow wearing nothing but socks. Whatever drove them into that darkness was, in their own minds, more dangerous than the cold that was already closing in. None of them came back. When searchers finally reached the tent, they found it half collapsed and abandoned, its fabric slashed open from within, the hikers' belongings still neatly inside. A line of footprints led down the mountain, away from safety, toward a forest where the rest of the story was waiting in the snow. These were not careless tourists. They were students, engineers, and athletes, trained for brutal winter expeditions. People like that do not abandon warmth and equipment in the middle of a lethal night, unless staying feels like certain death. So what were they running from? For more than 60 years, that question has refused to die. The official Soviet inquiry blamed a vague and overwhelming natural force, then quietly closed the file. That answer only made the mystery deeper. This is the Dyatlov Pass incident. In January 1959, a group of young Soviet adventurers set out into the northern Ural Mountains on a demanding winter expedition. The route was hard, the weather dangerous, the country remote and silent. To them, that difficulty was the entire point. In the Soviet Union, serious mountain expeditions were not casual hobbies but organized, graded, and respected achievements. Completing a tough winter route brought real status, and the people who attempted them were disciplined and capable. The group's leader was Igor Dyatlov, young and technically gifted, with genuine experience in the wilderness and the steadiness of someone used to responsibility. Most of those who followed him were students and graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute. They knew snow, they understood cold, and they had learned how to move as a team. Their goal was a mountain called Otorten, several days' march into the frozen wilderness. At the beginning, everything looked ordinary. Their own photographs show grinning faces, heavy packs, skis, and the easy energy of friends starting an adventure together. They traveled by train, then truck, then on foot, pushing steadily away from the towns and deeper into the cold. The group had been one person larger. A member named Yuri Yudin fell ill early on and turned back before the final stage in what felt at the time like nothing more than bad luck. That illness saved his life. 9 others went on into the mountains: Igor Dyatlov, Zinanita Kolmogorova, Rustem Slobodin, Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, Yuri Doroshenko, Yuri Krivonishenko, and Nikolai Tibabos Bringles. Their names would soon be bound forever to a mountain pass that did not yet carry Dyatlov's name. They pressed on, through deep snow, forest, and open slopes, under weather that could turn in minutes. The diaries and photographs from those days hint at no fear at all. Tired and uncomfortable at times, the group still stayed organized and in good spirits, building fires, joking, writing about the route, and absorbing delays the way seasoned travelers do. Then came the 1st of February. That day, the hikers reached the slopes near Kolotsiakal, a name often translated as Dead Mountain. In a remote landscape, such names tend to gather dark meanings they were never meant to carry. But once this story spread, that detail became impossible to separate from it. It seems the group made a navigational choice that left them on an exposed mountainside rather than down in the sheltered forest. There, in difficult conditions, they pitched their tent, cutting into the snow to level a platform. The hour was probably late, the light failing, the wind hard, the cold severe. Yet they were experienced enough to understand exactly what they were doing, which is what makes everything that followed so disturbing. Sometime in the night, something forced them out of that tent. Not in a calm, orderly evacuation, but in a way that left the canvas slashed open from the inside. That single detail sits at the heart of the mystery. If you are inside a tent in killing cold, and the entrance is right there, why cut through the wall instead? The likeliest answers are speed, terror, or an entrance that had suddenly become useless. Whatever the reason, the hikers fled without the boots, coats, and gear they needed to survive. And people who understand winter do not make that choice unless they believe that staying will kill them faster. They moved downhill. The footprints searchers later uncovered showed that at least some of them walked rather than ran toward the tree line, which is chilling in itself, because panic does not always look like chaos. Under extreme stress, a group can make a catastrophic decision in a calm and orderly way, fully convinced it is the safest thing left to do. Below the slope stood a tall cedar tree, and near it, searchers found the remains of a small fire. That fire tells its own quiet story because it means some of them reached the forest alive. They gathered branches and tried to build warmth, struggling to last long enough to outwait whatever had driven them down. But a small fire is nothing against deep winter wind when you are exhausted, underdressed, and exposed. 2 of them were found near the cedar, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, lightly dressed and killed by the cold. The branches above them had been snapped off, as if someone had climbed for wood or for a view back up the slope. A dark forest, a dying fire, and 2 young men beneath a tree, losing a fight against a night that had already turned against them. Between the cedar and the tent lay 3 more, Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin, their positions suggesting they had been trying to climb back toward the tent. That may be the saddest detail of all. Someone had understood that survival meant reaching the shelter again, where the clothing and the tools still waited, and they never made it. One after another, they fell in the snow. The last 4 were not found until much later, buried deep in a ravine. Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, and Nikolai Vitold-Brignoles. Their discovery only made the case stranger, because some carried serious internal injuries, fractures and trauma that seemed hard to explain by cold and exhaustion alone, and that convinced many people no simple answer could possibly be true. When the Soviet investigation finally closed, its conclusion was deliberately vague. The hikers had died because of an overwhelming natural force they had been powerless to resist. The phrase solved nothing. It only gave the mystery a shape and left a gap wide enough for decades of speculation to pour through. The questions came quickly. Why was the tent cut from the inside, and why did expert hikers run from shelter without their clothes? Some of the bodies carried severe injuries that were hard to explain. Traces of radiation turned up on a few items of clothing. A handful of witnesses spoke of strange lights in the sky, and the authorities had closed the file with unusual speed. Each question became a doorway into another theory. Some believed the group had been attacked, but that idea struggles against the evidence. There were no clear signs of a struggle with outsiders at the tent. Valuables were left behind, and the footprints did not show another group moving in. The hikers behaved like people fleeing an environmental threat, not human enemies. Others suspected a secret military test. This was the Cold War. The Soviet state was secretive, and secrecy breeds suspicion. Weapons testing was real, and the reports of lights in the sky fed the idea that something unnatural had happened above the mountains. But suspicion is not proof, and a hidden test cannot easily account for every physical detail without stacking one unverifiable assumption on another. And then there was the avalanche, the explanation most people rejected for years. The slope did not look steep enough for a great slide. There was no obvious wall of debris. The tent was not buried under tons of snow, and some of the hikers clearly walked away under their own power. A simple avalanche seemed far too ordinary for so strange a scene. But not every avalanche is a roaring wall of white. Some are small, local, and almost invisible after the fact, where a slab of wind-packed snow breaks loose and slides without leaving the dramatic evidence people expect. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the case, and in 2020 they pointed to an avalanche in poor visibility as the likely cause. Soon after, scientists writing in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment proposed a detailed mechanism for exactly this kind of event. Their reconstruction runs something like this. To pitch the tent, the hikers cut into the snow on the slope, leaving a small step above them. Through the night, the wind kept loading more snow onto that slope. The snowpack shifted, and hours later, a slab of it released, striking or threatening the tent in the dark. If the group believed a second, larger collapse was coming, then cutting their way out and retreating downhill was not madness. In that moment, it was the rational choice. That distinction is everything. From the outside, walking into a blizzard looks insane. From inside a tent that may have just been crushed or buried, it can feel like the only way to live. The plan was probably simple: get down to the forest, build a fire, wait for the snow to settle, then return for their gear. It failed only because the cold was too deep, the distance too far, and their clothing far too thin. That version strips away the monsters, the aliens, and the supernatural, and somehow makes the story more human rather than less. It becomes a study in how quickly survival can fall apart when every remaining option is bad. And yet even this explanation does not fully satisfy, because the Dyatlov Pass incident endures precisely in the gap between a plausible answer and the feeling that something about the scene is simply wrong. People do not only ask what happened, they ask how hikers this capable could be funneled into such a doomed sequence and why the whole picture still feels so haunted. Part of the answer is the photographs. When you see the group laughing at the start of the trip, the case stops being a file and becomes a story about people who fully expected to come home. They were young, with families and friends and plans of their own. One of them turned back over an illness and carried the memory of the others for the rest of his life. A single ordinary decision that turned out to separate living from legend. History often turns on moments that feel unremarkable as they happen. A late start, a slope chosen over a valley, a rising wind, a tent pitched here instead of there, a choice to leave shelter, a turn toward the trees, a failed attempt to climb back. None of it needed to feel historic to the people living it. It became history only because the ending was so absolute. When the group missed its expected return date, search teams of students, soldiers, and rescuers pushed into the region. The search itself was brutal and slow, the land vast, the weather able to erase a trail overnight. Then they found the tent, half sunk in snow, sliced open and empty, with boots and coats and food still inside. Imagine being one of those searchers. You expect to find people, injured or waiting or dead inside. Instead, you find an empty shelter and a knife wound in the canvas and a mountain that says nothing at all. From that moment, the mission stops being a rescue and becomes a recovery, and then a reconstruction, with every object turned into a clue. A coat left hanging, a cut in the fabric, prints leading down, a fire under a tree, broken branches, a body turned back toward the tent. Completing that sentence is what people have been attempting ever since. The most honest way to tell this story is not to pretend it has no explanation, because it very likely does. These hikers were almost certainly not killed by creatures or impossible forces, since nature in those mountains is terrifying enough on its own. But it is just as wrong to flatten the whole thing into one tidy line, because even the calmest explanation leaves the night itself nearly impossible to picture. What did they hear in the dark? Who decided they had to leave? Did they truly believe they would be back within the hour? Was there a shout that the tent was no longer safe? At the cedar, who lit the fire and who climbed for wood? Who chose to start back up the slope, and did they know the others were dying in the ravine below? Could the last person left alive understand that no one was coming? Those answers are gone. Science can model the snow, investigators can study the injuries, historians can reread the files, but no one can recover the thoughts of 9 people living through the worst night of their lives. That is why Dyatlov Pass still haunts us, and not because the wildest theories are true. It is because the ordinary explanation is frightening enough. A group of capable young people walked into the wilderness with confidence, and the mountains stripped that confidence away one piece at a time. Their shelter became a threat, their clothing slipped out of reach, the distance turned fatal, and the way back closed entirely. By morning, the expedition was simply over. The pass carries Dyatlov's name now. A title that once belonged to a young engineer leading his friends through the snow became attached to one of the most famous mysteries of the 20th century. He wanted to finish a route. Instead, his name became a question. If the slab avalanche reconstruction is right, the lesson is quietly devastating, because the hikers did not need to make foolish choices. They only needed to be trapped in a situation where every choice was bad. Stay in a damaged tent and risk being buried. Leave without proper clothing and risk freezing. Climb down to the forest and hope to outlast the storm. Turn back for the tent and collapse before reaching it. Each step makes sense on its own. Strung together, they become a catastrophe. That is how real disasters usually happen. Not as a single impossible event, but as a chain, a delay, a weather shift, a misjudged slope, a sudden noise, a fear that feels entirely justified, a plan that almost works, and then the cold to finish what the fear began. This story does not need a monster, and that may be the hardest part to accept. Monsters are oddly comforting because they keep tragedy in a separate category, far from ordinary life. If something impossible killed the hikers, the rest of us are safe from it. But if the cause was wind and snow and darkness and a few human decisions made under unbearable pressure, then the story sits much closer to home. It says that experience helps, but never makes us invincible, and that nature does not need cruelty to destroy, that a person spurk out. On their final night, the hikers had no idea they were becoming a legend. They were cold and frightened and trying to live. Perhaps they believed they would be back in the tent within the hour, or that the danger would pass, or that the fire would hold, or that someone among them had a better plan. The mountain gave them no time to find out. By the time the searchers arrived, the story had already hardened into evidence. A tent cut from within, footprints leading down the slope, a cedar tree, a dead fire, bodies in the snow, and questions no one could ever put to them. More than 60 years later, the pass is still frozen in the public imagination. Researchers have offered careful answers, officials have reopened the files, scientists have modeled the snowpack, and many of the old theories have quietly fallen away. But the image at the center has never lost its grip. 9 people in a tent, a sudden terror in the dark, a blade pulled through canvas, the freezing air rushing in, and then footsteps moving away from the only safety for miles. Whether the cause was a slab of snow, a savage wind, a terrible misunderstanding, or several small disasters folding into one fatal night, the ending never changes. They left the tent alive, and they did not return. The mountain kept their secret long enough for the world to turn it into legend. Every time the story is told, the same question rises again out of the snow. What made a 16-year-old boy, his body already wasting away with leprosy, rode out to face the most feared commander of the age? Everyone expected him to lose. His own court whispered that a king who could no longer feel his own hands could never defend a kingdom surrounded by enemies. The disease had begun to take his skin, his strength, his face. Some men would not even touch him. And yet, when Saladin marched toward Jerusalem, this dying teenager did not hide behind his walls. He rode out, and he won. History remembers him as Baldwin IV, the leper king of Jerusalem. The world later gave him a haunting image, a pale ruler behind a silver mask, silent and almost ghost-like. That mask belongs more to modern imagination than to anything medieval chroniclers clearly recorded, but it survived for a reason. Because Baldwin's real life already felt like legend. A sick child became king. A doomed body carried a crown. A teenager faced one of the greatest generals in history, and for one astonishing moment, stopped him. This is the story of Baldwin IV, the Leper King. Before Baldwin was a symbol, he was a child in a dangerous kingdom. He was born around the year 1161 into the ruling family of Jerusalem. The city he would inherit was not just a city. It was the heart of a fragile Christian kingdom planted in the eastern Mediterranean after the First Crusade and surrounded on almost every side. To the people who ruled it, Jerusalem was holy ground. To the Muslim powers around it, it was a wound that had to be healed. The kingdom survived on a knife's edge through diplomacy, fortresses, heavy cavalry, trade, and the constant readiness for war. A weak king could lose everything. A divided court could invite disaster. A single failed battle could open the road to the holy city. This was the world into which Baldwin was born. His father, Amalric I, was king of Jerusalem, and Baldwin was raised as a royal heir, taught languages, scripture, politics, and command. A prince was not raised to be comfortable. He was raised to lead men who might betray him and to ride into lands where mercy was rare. One of his tutors was William of Tyre, a learned churchman and historian. William was not only teaching a boy, he was watching the future of the kingdom grow up in front of him. At first, Baldwin seemed full of promise. He was intelligent, confident, quick to learn. Nothing about him suggested that his life would become one of the strangest tragedies of the age. Then came a small moment that changed everything. As a boy, Baldwin was playing with other noble children. They were rough with one another, the way children often are, scratching and pinching to test each other. When the others were hurt, they cried out. Baldwin did not. At first, it looked like courage, a prince refusing to show pain. But his tutor noticed something colder beneath the surface. Baldwin was not hiding the pain. He was not feeling it. The sensation had gone from his arm. In the medieval world, that detail was terrifying. Leprosy was not only a disease, it disfigured the body, deadened the nerves, and carried a stigma that could cut a person off from ordinary life. People saw it as impurity, as punishment, as a mark of divine judgment. For an ordinary person, it was a tragedy. For a royal heir, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. There may have been hope at first that the signs meant something else. A passing injury. A weakness that physicians could cure. But as Baldwin grew, the truth became impossible to deny. The prince had leprosy, a disease that would slowly strip him of feeling, strength, and life, and make those around him afraid to come close. Then, in the year 1174, King Amalric died. Baldwin was only 13. The kingdom of Jerusalem now belonged to a boy whose body was already marked by an illness everyone understood as a slow death sentence. The crown did not wait for him to grow strong. It landed on him while he was still a child, surrounded by ambitious men. At first, older nobles governed in his name, but the boy king stood at the center of a court full of factions. Some looked to his mother's family. Others backed rival branches of the aristocracy. Some genuinely cared about defending the kingdom. Many cared more about influence, titles, and the question that hung over everything. Because everyone knew the same thing. Baldwin would probably never have children. He might not live long. The future of Jerusalem was already being fought over while its king was still alive. There are kingdoms where power passes cleanly from father to son. Jerusalem was not one of them. It depended on proud, noble families who did not trust each other, on military orders with their own power, on European newcomers who barely understood local politics, and on native-born Franks who had spent generations learning how survival in the East really worked. Baldwin had to rule all of them at once. And beyond the court, a far greater danger was taking shape. His name was Saladin. For years, the Muslim world around the Crusader states had been divided, and that division was what kept Jerusalem alive. As long as Egypt and Syria were not united under one will, the kingdom could breathe. Saladin set out to end that. He rose first in Egypt, then extended his power into Syria. He was patient, politically skilled, and deeply motivated by faith. He understood that Jerusalem could not be taken by a single reckless attack. It had to be isolated, pressured, and surrounded until it fell. To many in the kingdom, Saladin was the storm gathering on the horizon. To Baldwin, he would become the defining enemy of his life. The tragedy of Baldwin IV is that he saw the danger clearly, even as his own body betrayed him. He was not a helpless king hidden behind his advisors. He was sharp, active, and stubborn. The illness limited him, but it did not erase him. He learned to ride even as he lost a feeling in his hands. He appeared on campaign. He made hard political decisions. He tried to hold together nobles who were often more interested in their rivalries than in survival. And all the while, the leprosy advanced. His hands weakened. His face and limbs suffered. Ordinary acts became difficult and painful to witness. Chroniclers wrote of the pity his condition stirred, but pity is dangerous for a king. A ruler who is pitied too much stops being feared. Baldwin could not allow that. He had to turn weakness into authority. He had to make men see the crown before they saw the disease. That is why the image of the mask endures, even though it is not firmly historical. It captures something true. Baldwin's rule depended on distance, ceremony, and control. He had to become more than his failing body. But Saladin would not wait for a sick king to feel secure. In the year 1177, Jerusalem faced one of the most dangerous moments in its history. Baldwin was around 16 years old. Saladin advanced out of Egypt with a large army, pushing into the southern part of the kingdom. Many of the Crusader forces were scattered or occupied elsewhere. The road toward Jerusalem lay dangerously open. For Saladin, it was an opportunity. For Baldwin, it was a test that could destroy him. The young king moved to Ascalon, a key fortress on the coast. Saladin's forces pressed in around him, pinning him down. From the outside, Baldwin looked trapped, a sick teenage king with a small force, cornered while a powerful enemy moved freely through his land. Saladin believed he had already won. He had the numbers. He had the momentum. He saw a weak boy behind stone walls. And that confidence became his undoing. As his army spread out to raid and forage, its discipline began to loosen. A large force can grow careless when it believes victory is certain. Men scatter to gather supplies. Commanders stop expecting an attack. The very size that made the army dangerous began to make it vulnerable. Baldwin saw his chance and he took it. He left Ascalon. This is the moment where the story becomes almost cinematic, because everything about it should have been impossible. A teenage king with leprosy, a small crusader force, an enemy commander of enormous reputation, and behind them, the holy city exposed. Baldwin moved against Saladin near a place called Montchesard. Picture it as later generations imagined it. The low desert light over the field, dust rising beneath the hooves, the great relic of the true cross carried before the army, armored knights forming for the charge, a young king, already marked by disease, refusing to let his body decide the fate of Jerusalem. Then the attack. The charge of heavy cavalry was one of the most devastating weapons the Crusaders had when it struck at the right moment. Armored knights moving together could shatter an army that was scattered and unready. At Montchesard, Baldwin's men hit Saladin exactly where he was weakest. Steel, horses, banners shouting, prayer, and panic. Saladin's confidence turned to shock. His army broke. The commander who had seemed ready to take Jerusalem was driven into a desperate retreat across the desert, losing much of his force on the way. For Baldwin, Montchesard became the heart of his legend. The sick boy had not merely survived, he had won. A king everyone expected to be weak had led his kingdom to one of its most stunning victories. The disease had not stopped him from becoming a symbol of defiance. Montgisard did not end the war. It did not destroy Saladin. It did not secure the future. But it bought time. And for Baldwin, time was everything. Because leprosy does not care about victory. It does not retreat when a king wins a battle. Quietly, steadily, cruelly, the disease kept doing its work. Baldwin's body weakened further. His ability to ride and fight declined. Tasks that had once been merely difficult became impossible. The king who had once led men from the saddle came to rely more and more on others. At times he had to be carried. At times he ruled through the hands and voices of those around him. And here the story turns from battle legend into political tragedy. Because Baldwin's greatest enemy was never only Saladin, it was time. He needed an heir. He needed stability. He needed nobles who would put the survival of the kingdom above their own ambitions. He did not get it. His sister Sibylla stood at the center of the succession, because her husband and her children could inherit the throne. The question of who would rule after Baldwin cut straight through the court. The kingdom was no longer just preparing for war. It was preparing for a future without the one man holding its pieces together. The most controversial figure of these years was Guy of Lusignan, Sibylla's husband. To some, he was a possible solution. To others, he was dangerous, untested, and divisive. Baldwin came to distrust him deeply. So the dying king did not simply hand him power. Instead, Baldwin had his young nephew crowned as co-king, Baldwin V. A desperate attempt to protect the succession and keep the kingdom out of the wrong hands. That decision matters, because it shows what Baldwin truly was. Not just a battlefield symbol, but a ruler, thinking like a king to the very end. His body was collapsing, but his mind stayed fixed on the survival of Jerusalem. And Saladin watched. He had been beaten, but not broken. Great commanders learned from defeat. He rebuilt his strength and waited because he did not need to win one final battle against Baldwin. He only needed Baldwin to die, and the kingdom to mishandle what came next. In that sense, Baldwin had become a wall. Not an invincible wall. Not a perfect one, but a real one. While he lived, Jerusalem still had a king whose name could rally men in a crisis, a ruler whose very suffering gave him a strange authority. Nobles who might have defied anyone else still had to measure themselves against a dying king who refused to let go of his realm. There is something deeply unsettling in that picture. A kingdom leaning on a man it knew could not last. A court planning for his death while desperately needing him alive. Enemies simply waiting for his body to fail. Baldwin IV died in the year 1185. He was only in his early 20s. He had spent almost his entire reign under the shadow of disease, faction, and war. He had inherited a fragile kingdom as a child, faced Saladin as a teenager, won a battle that became legend, and spent his final years trying to prevent the collapse he feared was coming. It came quickly. 2 years after his death, in the year 1187, Saladin destroyed the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin. The kingdom's military strength was shattered in a single day. Later that year, Jerusalem itself, the city Baldwin had fought so hard to protect, surrendered to Saladin. That is what gives Baldwin's life its tragic shape. He did not save Jerusalem forever. No single man could have. But while he lived, he held back the tide. He delayed the fall. He forced history to wait. The popular image fixes on the mask, the raised hand, the ghostly calm of a king who seems half human and half symbol. It is a powerful picture, but the real Baldwin is more interesting than the legend. He was sick, but not passive, young, but not irrelevant, doomed, but not useless. He governed nobles who were difficult even for healthy kings. He confronted Saladin as the Muslim world was uniting against him. He planned a succession he would never live to benefit from. He carried the sacred weight of Jerusalem, while his own body became a public reminder of mortality. His title, the Leper King, proves he never escaped the stigma of his disease. His real achievement was that the disease did not become the only meaning of his reign. When people remember Baldwin IV, they do not remember only the illness. They remember Montgisard. They remember resistance. They remember a boy king who faced Saladin and won, and the strange dignity of a ruler who had every excuse to vanish from history and refused. There is no need to invent miracles around him. The facts are already dramatic enough. A child's numb arm revealed a hidden disease. A 13-year-old inherited Jerusalem. A 16-year-old helped break Saladin in the field. A dying king fought to hold a divided realm together. And a kingdom outlived him by only 2 short years before the storm he had resisted finally broke through. So when we picture Baldwin behind a silver mask, we are seeing a symbol more than a fact. The real king may have worn bandages, or hidden his symptoms behind ceremony, or simply withdrawn from view as the disease grew worse. The silver mask belongs to our imagination, but symbols survive when they reveal something true. The mask tells us that Baldwin had to rule through distance, through control, through a refusal to let anyone reduce him to the thing that was destroying him. Behind the legend was a young man with a failing body and a kingdom in danger. Beyond his walls was Saladin. Inside his court were rival nobles. Above him hung the burden of Jerusalem. And beneath the crown were pain, numbness, and the certain knowledge that he would never grow old. Most kings fear losing their power. Baldwin knew he was losing himself. And yet, when the moment came, he did not become a footnote. He became the king who rode out. The king who would not step quietly aside. The king whose body was dying while his name was being carved into memory. The leper king of Jerusalem did not defeat death. No king does. But for a few critical years, he denied death its easiest victory. He made it wait. And while death waited, Baldwin IV held Jerusalem. A woman hangs laundry on a clothesline above the harbor. A black petticoat. Then 6 handkerchiefs. To any British soldier watching the shore, it means nothing. To the man in the whaleboat waiting in the dark water of Long Island Sound, it means everything. It means the courier has arrived. The intelligence can move tonight. This is how America's first spy network operated. Not with armies, with a clothesline, invisible ink, and the nerve of ordinary people who knew that if they were caught, they would hang. It is 1778. The revolution is 2 years old and losing. George Washington has suffered defeat after defeat at Brooklyn, at Kips Bay, at Brandywine. The Continental Army is ragged and underpaid. Morale is breaking. The British hold New York City, the largest city in North America, and they hold it absolutely. 30,000 troops. A fleet in the harbor. A population that is, by some accounts, more loyalist than patriot. Washington understands something the battlefield cannot teach him. He needs to know what the enemy knows. He needs to know what the enemy is planning before the enemy executes it. Intelligence is not just useful in this war. Intelligence may be the only way to survive it. He turns to a 24-year-old cavalry officer from Connecticut named Benjamin Tallmadge, Yale-educated, methodical, calm under pressure in a way that makes older men trust him without entirely understanding why. Washington gives him a task without precedent: build a spy ring, build it in secret, and build it so well that the British never know it exists. Tallmadge goes home to Setauket, Long Island, to the community he grew up in. He recruits from people he has known his whole life. People the British would never suspect. People with something to lose and reasons to risk it anyway. But first, picture what occupied New York actually looks like in 1778. Picture it clearly, because the danger these people were walking into was not abstract. The city is under martial law. British officers are billeted in private homes, sometimes over the objections of the families living in them. Loyalist informants watch the streets. There are checkpoints. There are passes required to move between districts. Men and women are searched at the ferries. Anyone suspected of communicating with the rebels faces questioning, imprisonment, and worse. The prison ships moored in Wallabout Bay. Old hulks, stripped of their masts, hold captured American soldiers in conditions so brutal that more men die on those ships than on any battlefield of the entire war. Disease, starvation, neglect. The British use them as a slow form of execution. This is the world that Abraham Woodhull walks into, week after week, pretending to sell vegetables. Woodhull is a farmer. Cautious, anxious, prone to catastrophizing. He is not a man who craves excitement. He is not by temperament a spy, which may be exactly the point. No one looks twice at a worried farmer from Long Island haggling over produce prices. Witold begins traveling into the city under this cover. He circulates and he listens. He watches troop movements, supply shipments, officer conversations at taverns and coffee houses, then carries the intelligence back to Long Island in his head, because writing it down in transit is death. The anxiety in Witold's letters to Talmadge is not performed. It is real and it is specific. He writes of soldiers quartered nearby who might search his home, of loyalist neighbors who watch him with too much interest, of the difficulty of obtaining the information at all without seeming to seek it. And still he keeps going. He has no particular gift for heroism, yet he goes anyway. Getting that intelligence across Long Island Sound, 20 miles of open water patrolled by British ships, requires another man. Caleb Brewster. If Witold is cautious, Brewster is the opposite, bold, reckless, joyfully dangerous. He commands a whaleboat crew that runs the Sound at night, slipping through British patrols, sometimes fighting off interception with musket and oar. He has been doing this kind of work before the ring exists and is, in some sense, the only man in the ring who seems to actually enjoy it. From a designated drop point near the shore, he picks up the intelligence bundles and delivers them across the water to Connecticut, where Talmadge and a chain of riders carry them to Washington's headquarters. For a while, this works. It is slow, imperfect, and terrifying for everyone involved, but it works. Then Witold needs a source inside the city itself, someone embedded, trusted, invisible. He recruits a young merchant and tavern co-owner named Robert Townsend. Townsend is a quiet man, withdrawn, almost melancholic. He writes for a loyalist newspaper under his real name, which gives him legitimate access to British officers who see him as a sympathizer, or at least as harmless. His shop and tavern on Pearl Street are gathering places where officers talk, where gossip flows with the rum, where a careful listener can learn things that armies cannot obtain with muskets. Townsend becomes Samuel Culper Jr. Witold, in the same system, becomes Samuel Culper Sr. Talmadge is John Bolton. Washington himself communicates with the ring through aliases and intermediaries so that if any single letter is captured, the chain cannot be fully traced. They use invisible ink, what they call a sympathetic stain, a chemical compound developed by a physician named James J., the brother of the statesman John J. A message written in this stain appears on the page as blank paper. It is invisible under ordinary examination. The recipient applies a second reagent, a developer, in the language we would use today, to reveal the text beneath. The British, even if they intercept a letter, see nothing but the innocuous surface text, or nothing at all. They know something is happening, somewhere in Long Island. They cannot read it. That alone would be remarkable, but the ring goes further. They develop a numerical code, a code book in which numbers represent common words and names, so that even a decoded invisible ink message reveals only a column of numbers that require a separate key to interpret. The number 711, for example, stands for the word enemy. The number 705 represents George Washington himself. Layer upon layer. Encryption, in effect, before the word existed in the way we now use it. The letters travel through the chain by specific route. Townsend writes in invisible ink between the lines of an ordinary letter or on blank pages tucked into a packet of goods. Witold collects the packet and carries it to a dead drop, a location known in advance to both parties, where items can be left and retrieved without the two people ever meeting. From there, a message goes to Brewster, who takes it across the Sound at night. From Brewster, it passes to a courier on the Connecticut shore, then to Talmadge, then to riders, and finally to Washington. The whole chain from Townsend's pen to Washington's hands might take a week. In wartime, over occupied territory, across open water, and yet it holds, month after month, year after year. Anna Strong, the wife of a local judge imprisoned by the British, is said to have served as a signal post. According to accounts that have come down through history, and here, honesty requires a hedge because historians continue to debate the details, She hung a black petticoat on her clothesline to indicate that Brewster had arrived, and a number of handkerchiefs corresponding to which of several coves he was hiding in. The British saw laundry. The Ring saw coordinates. Washington is famously demanding about his intelligence. He writes to Talmadge asking for more detail, more precision, less speculation. What he wants to know is not just what the British are doing, but what they intend to do. He wants names, numbers, dates, which regiments are moving, in which direction, and when. The Culper Ring obliges, slowly and dangerously, letter by letter carried by exhausted riders through a countryside that could turn hostile at any front. They are not the only Americans trying to gather intelligence. They are far from the only people at risk. In September 1776, 2 years before the Ring is even formed, a young schoolteacher named Nathan Hale crosses into British-occupied territory to spy for Washington. He is caught within days, hanged without trial, 21 years old. His last words are disputed, probably improved upon by later accounts. What is not disputed? He was caught and he was hanged, and everyone who comes after him in this war knows exactly what capture means. Woodhull knows, Townsend knows, every courier on the chain knows. And then, in the autumn of 1780, the Ring does something that no battle could have accomplished. Benedict Artemis, Womenitipair of the battles at Saratoga, where his Acovity won treatings, Womenitipair of the Transcendent, by time 1780, a traitor. For months he is boasted secretly, and for some time, by 1780, a traitor. For months he has been negotiating with the British to surrender the vital fort at West Point, the garrison controlling the Hudson River, the strategic spine of the continent, in exchange for money. A large sum, and it can The British contact for this arrangement is Major John Andre. Intelligent, charming, artistic. He sketches, writes verse, organizes theatricals to entertain the British officers in Philadelphia during the occupation. He is the head of British intelligence in America, in effect, and he is very good at his job. He and Arnold have been exchanging letters through intermediaries for more than a year. The arrangement is nearly complete. What disrupts it is not a battle. It is Townsend, in his tavern on Pearl Street, listening. The exact details of what Townsend heard and when are a matter of some historical debate. What is clear is that intelligence about a suspicious British military plot, a plot involving a high-ranking American officer and a secret meeting, makes its way through the chain. Townsend picks up fragments. Other informants contribute. The threads travel through the chain. Woodhull, Brewster, the writers, Talmadge. A warning, incomplete but alarming, reaches Washington. He begins to watch. Andre is captured in September 1780, traveling in civilian clothes near Tarrytown, New York, having met Arnold in person to finalize the details. Documents about West Point are found hidden in his boot, in his own stocking, folded against his leg. He has no pass that covers his route. Searched, he is taken. The plot unravels. Arnold, warned before he can be seized, escapes to a British ship on the Hudson River. He will spend the rest of his life in British service, despised by both sides. Andre is tried by a board of American officers as a spy. He is in civilian clothes behind enemy lines, carrying documents he should not have. He is convicted and hanged at Tappan, New York on October 2, 1780. He dies with considerable composure, by multiple accounts. Washington writes in his papers that the intelligence community contributed to discovering the conspiracy. He does not name the Ring. He cannot name the Ring. The Ring is still active. The war is still ongoing. There is something worth sitting with here. Andre was hanged as a spy, wearing civilian clothes, carrying documents he should not have had. Woodhull, Townsend, Brewster. They were doing exactly what Andre was doing. They were doing it longer, they were doing it in greater depth, and they were better at it. And if the British caught any one of them, the rope would have been the same. No trial necessarily. No ceremony. A spy caught in occupied territory behind enemy lines in civilian clothes. The legal and military precedent was clear. Nathan Hale had established it 4 years earlier. They knew this. Woodhull's letters to Talmadge are sometimes almost paralyzed with fear. He writes of the difficulty of his situation, the danger he is in, the anxiety that does not leave him. He describes the strain of maintaining a normal appearance in a community where loyalist neighbors are watching, the terror when a British officer he does not recognize stops to question him on the road. And still he keeps going, month after month, year after year. Not out of fearlessness, out of something quieter and perhaps more durable. In the final years of the war, the Ring warns Washington of British plans against the arriving French fleet under the Comte de Rochambeau, intelligence that helps protect the Franco-American alliance at a moment when it is still fragile. They feed misinformation to the British about troop positions. They monitor the city as the war's momentum shifts, watching British forces begin to thin, noting when officers who were constant fixtures in the city suddenly disappear. The British never find them. The Ring goes quiet when the war ends in 1783. Its members return to ordinary lives. Woodhull goes back to his farm and eventually becomes a judge and a local figure of modest prominence. Brewster marries and settles in Connecticut, or as close to settled as a man like Brewster ever got. Townsend retreats further into himself, running his mercantile business in New York, never speaking of what he did, never claiming the credit that history would eventually try to give him. Their identities are not publicly confirmed for more than a century. Researchers and historians work through letters, codes, and census records to piece together what happened. Townsend's role as Samuel Culper Jr. is not confirmed until the 1930s, when a historian named Morton Pennypacker matches his handwriting to documents in the intelligence chain. Robert Townsend had been dead for nearly 100 years by then. He never told anyone, not his children, not his neighbors, not the journalists and historians who, in the early years of the Republic, began writing accounts of the Revolution for a nation eager to celebrate its founding. He could have spoken up, and he did not. The secret went with him to the grave, and the secret held. Think about what that requires. Not the dramatic bravery of the battlefield, where fear burns off in the noise and movement of action. Something quieter and more sustained. The daily discipline of a man who walks through an occupied city, smiles at officers who would hang him if they knew, sits in his shop on Pearl Street, listens, writes nothing down yet, carries it all home in his head, and then writes it in invisible ink on a blank page, and trusts that the message will find its way across the Sound, through the chain, into the hands of a general who is trying to hold a country together by any means available to him. America turns 250 years old in 2026. Its independence was won in ways we celebrate easily: the crossing of the Delaware, the charge at Bunker Hill, the cannons at Yorktown. But it was also won in ways that leave no monument, no painting, no dramatic reenactment. In a farmer's cautious handwriting, in a merchant's silence, and in the steady pull of a whaleboat through dark water at 2 a.m. while British patrol boats move somewhere nearby. The clothesline story may be legend. The invisible ink is fact. So are the numerical codes, the dead drops, the decades of silence. And Robert Townsend's secret, kept so long and so completely that historians had to deduce it from the shape of his letters, is fact. Ordinary people. Extraordinary nerve. A war won not only on the battlefield but in the ordinary spaces between battles. A shop, a farm, a harbor at night, by people who left no record of their courage because leaving a record would have gotten them killed. This was Triakios. Some secrets kept a nation alive. Some names the nation never knew. They still echo. In December 1872, a ship was found drifting alone in the Atlantic Ocean. Its sails were still up. Its cargo was still on board. There was food, there was water, and personal belongings had been left behind. But every person who had sailed on that ship was gone. There were no bodies and no blood, no final message left behind, and no sign that anyone had fought for their life. Only an empty vessel, moving through the ocean as if it had been abandoned in the middle of a sentence. The ship was called the Mary Celeste, and more than 150 years later, it remains one of the most haunting maritime mysteries ever recorded. The strangest thing about the Mary Celeste was not that she was found destroyed. She was not. It was not that she was found sinking. She was not. The strangest thing was this: the ship was still capable of sailing, and yet everyone on board had chosen or had been forced to leave her behind. The question is simple. Why would an experienced captain, his family, and his crew abandon a ship that was still afloat? To answer that, we have to go back to New York Harbor in the final weeks of 1872. The Mary Celeste was not a ghost ship when she began her voyage. She was a merchant brigantine, a working ship, a vessel built for trade, not legend. She had carried cargo across dangerous waters before, and although her history had not been perfect, she was not considered cursed by the men who sailed her. In late 1872, she was prepared for a voyage from New York to Genoa, Italy. Her cargo was valuable. More than 1,000 barrels of industrial alcohol were loaded into her hold. The journey would be long, but it was not unusual. Ships crossed the Atlantic every year, some arriving safely, others delayed or damaged along the way, and a few that were never seen again. But the Mary Celeste was commanded by a man who knew the sea. His name was Benjamin Briggs. Captain Briggs was neither reckless nor inexperienced. He came from a seafaring family, and by all accounts he was a disciplined, careful, respected captain, the kind of man other sailors trusted. And on this voyage, he was not sailing alone. With him were his wife Sarah and their young daughter Sophia. That detail makes the mystery feel different. This was not only a commercial voyage, it was also a family journey. A captain, his wife, their child, and 7 crew members were crossing the Atlantic together. 10 people in total, 10 lives, 10 voices, 10 sets of footsteps on the deck. And soon all 10 would vanish. Before departure, nothing seemed obviously wrong. The ship was loaded, the crew chosen, the destination clear. But the weather in New York was poor, and the Mary Celeste did not immediately rush out into the open Atlantic. She waited. Then, when conditions improved, she left New York behind and began her journey east. Another ship was also preparing to cross the Atlantic. Her name was Dei Gratia. She would leave New York after the Mary Celeste, following a similar route across the ocean. At the time, no one could have known that these 2 ships would become connected forever. The Mary Celeste sailed first. The Dei Gratia followed days later. One ship carried a captain, a family, a crew, and a cargo of alcohol. The other carried men who would soon find a mystery waiting for them in the open sea. For several weeks, the Mary Celeste moved across the Atlantic. We do not know every moment of that voyage. We do not know every conversation on deck. We do not know every concern Captain Briggs had as the weather changed and the ship pushed eastward. But we do know this. The last known entry in the ship's log was written days before she was discovered. At that point, the Mary Celeste was near the Azores. After that, the written record simply ends. Not with panic, not with warning, not with the words, "We are sinking." Just silence. And then, on a cold December day, the crew of the Dei Gratia saw something strange on the horizon. A ship. At first, it may have looked like any other vessel in the distance. But as they watched, something felt wrong. The ship was moving strangely. Her sails were set poorly. She did not respond properly. No one appeared on deck, and no signal came back. The captain did not answer, the crew did not wave, and no one called for help. The captain of the Dei Gratia, David Morehouse, changed course and approached. As the distance closed, the name of the strange vessel became clear. Mary Celeste. This should not have been possible. The Mary Celeste had left New York before the Dei Gratia. She should have been much farther ahead. Maybe she should have already reached Genoa. But there she was, drifting in the Atlantic, hundreds of miles from land. Captain Morehouse sent men across to investigate. Imagine that moment. A small boat moving over restless water. 2 sailors approaching a silent ship. The wooden hull rising beside them. Ropes hanging loose. The sound of waves slapping against the side. There were no voices, no footsteps, no command from above. They climbed aboard and found no one. The Mary Celeste was empty. Not quiet, not sleeping, simply empty. There was no captain, no wife, no child, no crew. The men searched the deck. They searched the cabins. They searched the hold. They looked for signs of violence, for bodies, for anything at all that could explain how 10 people had disappeared from a ship in the middle of the Atlantic. But the more they looked, the stranger the mystery became. The cargo was still there, the food untouched, and the personal belongings of the captain and crew had not been looted. There was no obvious evidence of pirates. No sign of a massacre, no blood-soaked deck, no broken weapons scattered after a fight. The ship was damaged, but not destroyed. There was water in the hold, but not enough to prove she was sinking beyond hope. Some sails were torn, some equipment was missing or disturbed, and the lifeboat was gone. That missing lifeboat became one of the most important clues in the entire case. Because if the lifeboat was gone, then the people on board may not have simply vanished. They may have left the ship deliberately. But why? Why would Captain Briggs order his family and crew into a small boat in the middle of the Atlantic? Why leave behind a larger ship with supplies, cargo, and shelter? Why abandon the safest thing they had? That is the heart of the Mary Celeste mystery, not whether the ship was empty. We know it was. The real mystery is what kind of fear was powerful enough to make experienced sailors leave a seaworthy vessel behind. The men from the Dei Gratia brought the Mary Celeste under control. Eventually, the abandoned ship was taken to Gibraltar, where an official inquiry began. But the inquiry did not solve the mystery. Instead, it created more questions. Some people suspected crime. Perhaps pirates had attacked, but pirates usually stole valuable cargo, and here the cargo remained. Personal belongings remained. There was no clear evidence of robbery. Maybe the crew of the Dei Gratia had done something terrible. After all, they had found the ship and later claimed salvage money. But again, evidence was lacking. There was no proof of murder, no bodies, no convincing signs of a staged crime. Maybe the crew of the Mary Celeste had mutinied. Maybe they had killed Captain Briggs and fled. But this theory also struggled. Why take the lifeboat into the open sea, leaving behind supplies and valuables? And why would every single person aboard disappear forever? The theories grew because the evidence was incomplete. And when evidence leaves gaps, imagination rushes in. Over time, the Mary Celeste became more than a maritime case. It became a legend. People imagined sea monsters and ghosts, madness and curses, secret crimes, explosions that left no fire, and waterspouts rising from the sea. But the truth, if we are careful, is probably not supernatural. It is probably something more human. Fear, confusion, bad information, a decision made under pressure, and one that could never be undone. One of the most serious theories involves the cargo. The Mary Celeste was carrying industrial alcohol. Alcohol gives off vapor. And under certain conditions, vapor can create fear of explosion. Some of the barrels were later found to have leaked. This has led some researchers to suggest that Captain Briggs may have believed the ship was in immediate danger. Maybe there was a sudden release of vapor from the hold. Maybe the crew smelled alcohol. Maybe they heard a sound below deck. Maybe the hatch cover shifted. Maybe they feared the ship could explode. If Captain Briggs believed an explosion was possible, even if he was wrong, he may have ordered everyone into the lifeboat temporarily. Not to abandon the Mary Celeste forever, only to wait at a safe distance. In this version, the plan was simple. Leave the ship, stay tied to her by a rope, and wait for the danger to pass before returning. But the sea punishes small mistakes. If the rope broke, the lifeboat would drift away. The Mary Celeste, still under sail, would move faster than the small boat. Within minutes, the ship could become unreachable. Within hours, the people in the lifeboat would be alone in the Atlantic. With no shelter and little water, they had no real chance. The Mary Celeste would continue sailing, and the people who left her would disappear. This theory is chilling because it does not require monsters. It does not require murder. It only requires one wrong decision at the worst possible moment. Another theory focuses on water. There was water in the hold, and one or more pumps may not have been working properly. A captain who cannot accurately measure the water inside his ship has a serious problem. If Briggs believed the Mary Celeste was taking on more water than she really was, he may have thought the ship was doomed. In rough seas, with damaged sails and faulty readings, fear could become logic. The safest decision might have seemed to be evacuation. But again, the same problem returns. Why leave in the lifeboat unless the danger felt immediate? Why not stay aboard until there was no other choice? A captain like Briggs would not abandon ship lightly, especially not with his wife and child aboard. So whatever happened, it must have seemed urgent. Another possibility is weather. The Atlantic is not gentle in winter. A sudden storm, violent waves, or a waterspout could have terrified the crew or damaged the ship in ways that are not obvious after the fact. If the Mary Celeste was struck by heavy weather, sails could tear, equipment could shift, and water could enter the hold. The captain may have believed the ship was in danger. He may have ordered the lifeboat launched as a temporary safety measure. Maybe once again they meant to return. Maybe the rope broke. And once more, the ship drifted away without them. This is one reason the Mary Celeste remains so haunting. The most believable explanations are not dramatic in the way legends are dramatic. They are practical. A leaking cargo, a broken pump, a misread danger, bad weather, and a lifeboat tied to a ship by a single rope. Then one snap of the rope, one wave, one gust of wind, and everything changes. 10 people are separated from the only thing keeping them alive. The ship survives. The people do not. There is also the question of Captain Briggs himself. Some mysteries grow because people imagine the captain as unstable or foolish. But Briggs does not seem to fit that role. He was experienced, careful, religious, and respected. A man with a family aboard has every reason to be cautious. That makes the abandonment harder to explain. But it also points toward a specific kind of situation. He probably did not leave the ship because of a small problem. He probably left because he believed the ship presented an immediate threat. A threat worse than the open sea. That is the key. For the lifeboat to make sense, the Mary Celeste had to seem more dangerous than the ocean, even if only for a few minutes. Even if that judgment was wrong. Think of the final moments, not as a ghost story, not as a fantasy, but as a human scene. The captain studies the water in the hold as the ship creaks and the wind rises. A crewman reports something wrong below deck, and the smell of alcohol hangs in the air. The pumps are not giving clear answers, the sails are damaged, and the sea is rough. Sarah Briggs holds her daughter close. The crew waits for orders. Captain Briggs has to decide. Stay aboard and risk explosion, sinking or disaster, or launch the lifeboat and wait nearby until the danger passes. He chooses the lifeboat. They lower it over the side. One by one, they climb in. Maybe they take only what they need for a short wait. Maybe they believe they will be back soon. The rope is secured. The lifeboat pulls away and the Mary Celeste rises and falls beside them. For a moment, the plan works. The ship is close, the people are safe, and the captain watches as they wait. Then something happens. A wave, a gust, a sudden shift in the ship's movement. The rope strains. The fibers tighten. Then it breaks. The Mary Celeste begins to move away, slowly at first, then faster. The people in the lifeboat shout, the crew pulls at the oars, and the captain gives his orders. But the ship has the wind, the lifeboat has only men. The distance grows and the Mary Celeste becomes smaller, her deck empty, her sails catching the air. The ship keeps moving, and the people who once commanded her are left behind in the Atlantic. No one on the Dei Gratia saw that moment. No one wrote it down, and no survivor ever told the story. It is only a reconstruction, a possibility. But it explains why a ship could be found empty, still afloat, with its lifeboat missing and its people gone. It explains how the Mary Celeste could survive while everyone aboard vanished. And that may be the darkest part. The ship did not need to kill them. She only needed to leave them behind. After the inquiry, the Mary Celeste continued to exist. That feels strange. In legends, cursed ships disappear into fog forever. But in reality, the Mary Celeste was just a vessel. She was repaired, sold, and sailed again. Her name, however, was never free of the mystery. To the public, she was no longer just a merchant ship. She was the ghost ship, a floating question, an empty deck moving through history. Years later, her story would be retold again and again, often with details exaggerated or invented. Some versions said meals were still warm on the table. That was not true. Some said pipes were still smoking. That was not true. Some turned the case into a supernatural tale. But the real story does not need those details. the truth is already strange enough. A ship was found abandoned, her people gone and her lifeboat missing, while her cargo and supplies remained. And no one ever discovered exactly why. That is enough. Because the best mysteries are not always the ones filled with monsters. Sometimes the best mysteries are the ones where the facts are simple, but the explanation is just out of reach. The Mary Celeste asks us to imagine a final decision. A captain standing on deck, a family waiting, a crew watching the sea. A ship that seems dangerous, a lifeboat that seems safer. A choice made quickly, a rope breaking, a vessel sailing away without the people who trusted her. And then silence. No graves, no final letters, no confession, no answer at all. Only the ocean. The Atlantic kept its secret, and the Mary Celeste kept sailing. That is why the story still echoes. Not because we know what happened, but because we almost can. We can see the empty deck, hear the wind in the rigging, and picture the missing boat. We can imagine the captain turning back toward his ship as it drifts away, realizing too late that the decision meant to save them may have doomed them all. In the end, the Mary Celeste was not found at the bottom of the sea. She was not burned. She was not shattered. She was found alive. But without her people. A ship can survive a voyage. A story can survive a century. And sometimes the most terrifying thing left behind is not destruction. It is absence. In December 1872, the Mary Celeste was discovered in the Atlantic Ocean. The ship was still there, the cargo and the food still aboard, the sea still moving beneath it all. But Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their daughter Sophia, and the crew were gone. They were never seen again. No one knows exactly what made them leave. No one knows how long they survived after they did. No one knows where the ocean finally took them. All we know is that one day, in the middle of the Atlantic, a ship kept sailing after everyone aboard had vanished. And more than 150 years later, the Mary Celeste is still drifting through our imagination. Not as proof of ghosts, not as proof of monsters, but as a reminder. The sea does not always need to destroy a ship to create a legend. Sometimes it only has to empty it. This was Tri-Echoes. Some stories do not end. They echo.